Well, good evening, everyone. For those I've not met, my name's John Highbush. I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. If you would, in honor of our men and women who defend our freedom around the world, if you please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Probably just about everyone here is a member of this community, and while we don't do this often, we do it certainly when it's appropriate, and that is, I might ask if everyone would join me in a moment of silence for the victims of the recent fires here in Southern California and Northern California as well. Many have lost their lives and their homes. Thank you very much. At last count, there's now more than 1,000 books that have been written about Ronald Reagan, for whom this library is named after. And after a while, there's so many, one begins to look and lose track of which is which. No doubt, I think that same thing holds true for the number of books that have been written about a popular topic called leadership, although there must be at least 100 times that number of books on the shelves. It seems that just about everyone who has considered themselves a leader in their field, or at least an expert on leadership, has joined the publishing fray. There's been no shortage of those in the business world or the sports world or the world of politics and government, any endeavor that calls for competition of one form or another, who are interested in revealing their secret formula for what it takes to stand out as a leader or dare to be great in difficult times or circumstances. What have we learned from all of this leadership knowledge? Well, that leaders eat last, that many seem to have formed 7 habits. They practice something called emotional intelligence. And if you try real hard, you too can lead by being a 1-minute manager, for example. I want to separate those efforts and axioms from the studies on leadership that stem from a valuable context that very few of us will ever experience in our lives. I think it unlikely we will find any place on this earth where leadership is more tested than on the battlefield. A moment in time when one's life is in peril, or perhaps those closest to you might be in peril. When we find such examples where a truly great leader in those circumstances has written a study of other great leaders, it's worth taking note. Definitely worth a read. With us today is General Stanley McChrystal. He has been defined by a true patriot, former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, as one of America's greatest warriors. Known for his leadership as commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, called JSOC, he was responsible for leading our nation's military counterterrorism efforts around the world for years. In that role, he oversaw Operation Red Dawn, the capture of Saddam Hussein in October 2003, the killing of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq in June 2006, as well as the defeat of al-Qaeda itself in Iraq during the surge there in 2007. Suffice it to say that a whole generation of soldiers have had the fortune of serving under his leadership and learning from his example. He has often been outspoken, saying what other military leaders think, but have not had the courage to say. A whole generation of readers have previously enjoyed his New York Times best-selling memoir, My Share of the Task, and his book, Team of Teams, a recounting of his experience as JSOC commander and how those leadership lessons put in practice on the battlefield can apply across the competitive landscape of other walks of life. He joins us today for a conversation on his newest treatise on leadership entitled Leaders, Myth, and Reality. Tonight's event occurs, fittingly, just 2 days after we unveiled a Gold Star Family Memorial here at the Reagan Library. It stands only paces from the final resting place of President and Mrs. Reagan. For those of you not familiar with these monuments, they serve as reminders of the valor displayed by those who have fallen in combat and the families that they've left behind. Many such brave men and women were led by our distinguished guest tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome to the Reagan Library a leader of the First Order, someone to whom we owe a great deal. He is truly one of our nation's finest practitioners and scholars on leadership, General Stanley McChrystal.
Let me fix your mic real quick. There you go.
It is an honor to introduce someone of the caliber of General McChrystal. This is one of my most important events, I think, here at the library, so thank you so much for coming, General.
Well, John, thanks for having me, and I'm going to try to say as little as possible because after that introduction, everything I say is going to decrease my reputation in your eyes, so thanks for having me. And let me just double what John said. To come out tonight for this event when all that's going on in the area is extraordinary and to me humbling. And I hope that you come out because we all think leadership is so important. If you came out to see me, you're probably thinking, I thought he'd be taller. But I really look forward to this. Thank you.
I have more questions than we have time for, General, but what we'll do is I get to ask my smart questions, and then after that, we'll turn it over to you in the audience to ask a number as well later on. And my first question, you cover this in the book, but it's something I've thought about for some time. You know, we all love great movies, and one of my most favorite is Patton. You know, there's a famous scene in the movie where he talks, he's about to go up against who he thinks is Rommel in the desert in Africa. And, you know, he yells and screams about, Rommel, I read your book. You know, and the whole point is that Patton spent a good deal of time trying to understand his enemy and walking in his enemy's shoes. And I wonder, you have many many compliments about your career with respect to things that you've done. But one of them, very poignantly, as I said, was the capture of Saddam Hussein, the Zarqawi defeating him, finding him, and killing him on behalf of freedom. And I wonder, did you meet that enemy the way that Patton would talk about it, with really a studied example of trying to understand how he and his forces operated? Is it similar to what we see in the movies?
That's a really thoughtful question. The answer is yes, but not initially. I was part of a very elite task force, a special operations task force that was part of JSOC, which I commanded. It was Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the Rangers, and all put into this really extraordinary collection of people that I was honored just to be a part of. And so when we got serious about the war in Iraq, remember there was the invasion in the spring of 2003, and that was theoretically going to be simple, and the invasion was, but then Iraq started to descend into this sort of apocalyptic netherworld of violence and sectarian problems, and then the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I think like a lot of soldiers, at the first part of it, we thought we could solve the problem initially. We'd go after certain bad guys and capture or kill them. And this guy, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, we'd known who he was. We were aware of his background as a Jordanian. We did all the normal study of him. I went to Jordan and spoke to the Jordanian intelligence people who knew him quite well. But I don't think we really respected him at that point. I think we thought of him as a terrorist, and that's a misguided, violent person. And one of our earliest things, we'd had this report that he was doing biological weapons before the invasion. And then when we got inside Iraq, we couldn't find him. And then the end of 2003, just right after Saddam Hussein was captured, we got confirmation that Zarqawi was in fact inside the country. And so now he put a face on what was this growing, metastasizing terrorist organization. And suddenly we realized we had a formidable foe in this group and a formidable leader in the group. Then in the spring of 2004, when Fallujah started to become a serious battleground, remember the country started to melt down, we were really struggling with dealing with it, and they brought into the operations center a laptop, and they said, "Sir, we've got," we knew a bunch of Americans were missing at that point, to include a young man named Nicholas Berg, and my guys brought in a laptop and said, "Sir, you got to watch this," and we had captured a video, and it was 6 guys standing behind a young man, Nicholas Berg, sitting in an orange jumpsuit. And they made an announcement, and I'm watching it. And then the gentleman right behind him pushed him on the side, pulled out a big knife, and beheaded him. And I remember watching this thing, and I was stunned because I'd seen things in my life in war and whatnot. But that was more cold-blooded. And I remember my hands were tensed up. When I finished watching it, I had to consciously ungrip my hands. And we found out pretty quickly that that was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi himself. And that's when we began this. It was a campaign against him that became somewhat personal. And it started personal, like he was vermin and we were just going to wipe him out. And that seemed appropriate. But over the next almost 2.5 years, as that fight went on, and it was incredibly bloody, we lost people, we killed a lot of his people, and innocent Iraqis died in the thousands. And we did this cat and mouse game and this struggle against him. What happened was he started to become a person to me, not vermin, not a nameless terrorist. He started to become a leader that, to be honest, I had to respect. I didn't have to agree with, I didn't have to like, we wanted to capture or kill him, and we did. But the reality was he was an effective leader, and he was a committed leader. He was a zealot, as we describe him now, but he had this white-hot passion for his cause, and that made him magnetic to followers who weren't nearly as extreme as he was, but they were attracted to him because here's somebody so sure of himself and let it. And I was probably not as willing to admit it in the moment as I became toward the end of it. I learned a lot from him. He changed how I led, because to defeat his organization, we had to fundamentally change how my organization worked. I think we got a little bit more humble, because for the first 2 years, they were beating us. I mean, they were defeating us. And you think, well, how can that happen? We're the United States of America. We're the most elite part of the force. And yet they were better than us. It was only when we learned. It was only when we adapted. It was only when we admitted that if you don't take this seriously, you don't take him seriously, you lose. And I came out with a real grudging admiration for that aspect of it. And then the other thing that I came to understand was he believed in his cause. I didn't believe in his cause, and I still don't, but he did. And who's to say that I'm right and he's wrong? Who's to say that if I wasn't born in the same place he had with the same circumstances, I wouldn't have felt the same way. And so it was a good lesson in unlocking your mind a little bit to what you have to be.
Some humility in a sense.
Yes, sir.
Let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum. Like Patton, I read your book. Thatcher, you know, what an incredible partner and ally with President Reagan, and I know you studied her and her leadership style and how she achieved all the success that she did. And I noticed that you also reference Churchill, too. And I thought when I picked up the book that you were going to focus on Churchill, and you didn't. Well, you certainly discussed him, but he wasn't one of your positive leadership examples, and I wonder if you would address that.
Sure. When you think of what leaders provide us, and I think we're in a perfect place for that, leaders provide sometimes absolute direction. They make decisions. They do certain things. But I really think what leaders do is they inspire us to be better than we'd otherwise be. If a good leader's around, we stand a little taller. There used to be a tradition in the British Navy that when old sailing ships, or wooden sailing ships, came into combat on the top deck, it was very, very lethal place because fire would come across it and enemy snipers in the rigging would shoot. And enlisted sailors were allowed, when the fighting starts, to lie down on the deck because there were small walls at the edge of on the side of the ship. But officers were expected to stand up. And there's a story of one midshipman, as the fighting starts, he throws himself to the deck. And then he looks around and he sees other officers standing up and he goes, oh, damn. And he stands up. I think that's what leaders make us do. And what Margaret Thatcher did was she grew up in the shadow of Winston Churchill. And if you look at Winston Churchill's career, he had almost as many failures as I do. And, you know, First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War, Gallipoli, absolute disaster. Then he spent the 1920s and 30s sort of in the wilderness as this not very well respected, somewhat hardline politician. And then he intersects in a moment in the spring of 1940 when Britain needs a leader with absolute commitment, absolute courage, and the ability to inspire. And Winston Churchill's there, and it intersects perfectly. 2 years later, he's not as popular, and right as soon as the war ends, he's voted out of office, literally right at the end of the biggest victory in the Second World War. But in that critical moment, he was exactly right. He was exactly necessary. And Margaret Thatcher grew up in the shadow of that. She grew up in the Tory party. And then in the 1970s, when Britain had lost its confidence, it was struggling internally with political battles, unions, different things. It had lost most of its empire, so much of its self-esteem was at least in danger. Margaret Thatcher comes up, they called it the winter of discontent, and she says, no, we are not going to relegate ourselves to be a third-rate nation. We are not going to be yesterday only. We are going to be a great nation. We have got to believe, and we've got to act that way. And it's extraordinary. She made some tough policy decisions, and she stuck with it. But I think her unwillingness to waver from what she believed was right inspired a nation. And for 11 years, she inspires a nation. Now, after 11 years, it was time for her to move on and someone else to take it. But if you think of that contribution, sometimes it's the courage and the commitment that matters more than anything else.
I don't remember the precise number, at least a dozen of the leadership examples that you have in your book. I wondered if there was any that surprised you, where you felt, no, that person shouldn't be included, but then after some study you thought, absolutely, they fit the model. Were there any like that?
Yeah, there's one that fit the model. It was Coco Chanel. Got retired Army guy writing about Coco Chanel. Didn't see that coming. Truth is, I didn't know she was a person. And how would I? And we put together this team to work on the book. We had 3 authors, then we hired these 3 young people, one from Yale, one an Oxford, then Harvard graduate, and then another Yale. And we put these 3 young people together, and they did a lot of the research. And one young lady named Dixie, she goes, we should include Coco Chanel. And I go, who? And but when we studied her, here's an orphan from rural France who grows up. She's initially a nightclub singer. She becomes a courtesan for some army officers, basically. But she's got this incredible ability. First, she becomes a pretty good fashion designer. She's got the ability to see a moment. And she sees a time when fashions are heavy, the big old kind of corseted stuff. And that's expensive, it's uncomfortable, and women are entering the workplace and they want more freedom. And she says, let's liberate this. And not only does she design fashion for it, she becomes the fashion mannequin, the living mannequin. She dresses that way, she acts that way. She has a lifestyle, and she says, be like Coco Chanel. And she invites people to be like her. And it's a great lifestyle. And so people do. And then, of course, she creates Chanel No. 5, the perfume. She creates this massive empire, fashion empire. She retains creative control of it until late in life. And she makes mistakes. She spends the Second World War in an affair with a Nazi officer, and that was not well looked at. But the reality was she was an amazing person, and people wanted to be around her and they wanted to work for her because she took something forward. And so I never expected to find, particularly in a time when it was hard for a female in a business world to make that kind of leap forward, to find somebody that towered.
When I saw this next chapter, I was heading to Robert E. Lee, I thought, okay, well, here comes the typical general's view of the typical persona that we see as Robert E. Lee, and you were going to be laudatory and the rest, but you have a whole story around that. I wonder if you would tell it.
Sure, John, thanks. The first thing is to understand that back in 1977, my young wife and Andy and I had been married for 41 years now. I was a second lieutenant, we had no money, and she bought me a painting. And it wasn't even a painting, it was a sort of a cheap print where they paint over in clear acrylic to make it look like brushstrokes. And for $25 framed, she got me a painting that I kept for the next 40 years. And it was a painting of General Robert E. Lee. And I treasured it. And it's not surprising. I'd grown up near Robert E. Lee's boyhood home. I'd gone to Washington Lee High School. When I was 17, I went to West Point, same place that Robert E. Lee went to school. I took the oath to the nation on the plane, just where Robert E. Lee has. I lived in Lee Barracks. And then when I went into a career, I followed a path in many ways that Robert E. Lee had. I entered the profession. He served for 32 years before the Civil War, and I did similar. But in the spring of 2017, one morning, Sunday morning, late spring, I took the picture off the wall, took it to the garbage, and threw it away. And the next day, the garbage men took it to the dump. And that was not an unemotional act for me to do, and it wasn't an easy one. But it came because Annie had come to me about a month before, and she said, I think you need to get rid of that picture. And I said, no, I can't get rid of that picture. You gave it to me. And she says, all right, I think you need to get rid of it. And I said, why? She goes, because I think he symbolizes something you don't believe in. And I said, well, this was soon after Charlottesville. And General Lee would not have believed in many of the things that were represented at Charlottesville, but his symbol was being used by some people for that. And so she goes, I think unintentionally, people come to our house, they may infer from that picture that you're trying to signal something that you don't believe in. And I came to the conclusion she was right. Now, on the first hand, that sounds like I just blow with the winds of popular opinion and it comes and goes. It actually wasn't that simple. I wanted to think about what I was communicating to people, but also we were just starting the book, and I went back and said, we're going to profile Robert E. Lee and we're going to study him. I mean, hard. Because I'd grown up thinking Robert E. Lee was the perfect soldier, and in many ways he was. If he was here tonight, he'd be the most impressive person in the room. He graduated from West Point with the moniker, the Marble Man. And that was given to him by other cadets because he was so perfect. He went through 4 years at West Point and didn't get a demerit. I did not do that. Then when he went in the military, he was stoic. He was driven by duty. He was polite. He was courteous. He was all those things. And for the first 17 years of his career, he was a well-respected officer, but had no combat experience. Then as an engineer, captain, he went to the Mexican War. He was a staff officer and said, what's a staff officer going to do to distinguish themselves? But he came out of the war as the most respected young officer. He did these extraordinary exploits of reconnaissance to track routes to Mexican positions. At one point, he alone went up, ran into the Mexican forces, had to hide under a log for hours while they talked right above him. Then they walked away. He escaped back and then led U.S. forces up. So much so that the commanding general, Winfield Scott, said he was the most impressive officer in combat that he'd ever seen. So he comes out of the Mexican War, a rising hero, becomes a superintendent of the military academy, and is completely a United States Army professional. Then in the spring of 1861, after decades of arguments over slavery and various issues, the Deep South made the decision to secede from the Union, the 7 states of the Deep South. But there were the other states of the Upper South hadn't decided, and the nation started to cleave in half. And he was out at Fort Mason, Texas as a regimental commander. And essentially what's happening is the army is cleaving in half. People are going both ways, and they're trying to hold military units together because one minute you're brothers, and the next minute there's this great distrust. And so he is trying to decide what he's going to do. He's a Virginian, but he's also from the line of George Washington. George Washington is his hero, and George Washington had helped to create the United States. So Robert E. Lee spends the weeks before secession reading Edward Everett's 3-volume biography of George Washington, trying to figure out what he should do. He comes back east, and he's offered command of Union forces, Northern forces, which was a shrewd move because Abraham Lincoln would have loved to get a Virginian to command because it would have been a good signal because Virginia still had not seceded. Robert E. Lee says no, and he says, I will do what Virginia does. I'm against secession, but I will do what my state does. And on the one hand, for years I said, well, that's a loyal thing to do. That's, you just fall in line. Actually, what he did was he took the most important decision of his life and he gave it to a popular referendum. And when Virginia voted to secede, he went first to Virginia, and then they joined the Confederacy. And so Robert E. Lee spent that moment first violating the oath, the same one I'd made at West Point, turning against the country that he'd sworn himself to and served for 32 years, spent 4 years trying to essentially destroy the United States of America, to cut it in half. And regardless of how we did it, he did it in defense of slavery. Now, I can't square that. I can't forget that. Now, if someone asks me, do I forgive him? It's not for me to forgive. It's for me to take that into account. He's not a two-dimensional figure. He's not a painting on my wall. He's not a statue that's perfect. He's a human being. He's flawed. I think he made a big mistake. I've made big mistakes. And so for me, it makes him real. It makes him human. And it makes us responsible to look at all of our leaders in a three-dimensional, very realistic way. Not to become bedazzled by someone's celebrity or their charisma or icons of them, but instead to think of them as real people. Hold them to account, but also be forgiving for the humanity.
You know, we've all heard the expression born leader.
Yes, sir.
In all of your study of leadership, do you believe in that concept? Do you believe that people are just plain born as a leader? Or no, it's actually something you can teach your children?
I think it's the latter. I think you are born with certain advantages or disadvantages. You might be very intelligent. You might be very well-spoken. You know, things like that, which can be helpful. But I think leadership is not something a person has. You and I aren't leaders. We don't have leadership in our pocket we can stand up and throw at people. Leadership is a relationship between leaders and followers, and then the context of the moment. It's something that happens. And so the reason I say that is I think you learn how to interact with people, how to empathize with people. I think you create a relationship, and it's contextual in the extreme. One of the things we found that was interesting is, and you, in your wonderful introduction, you talk about our quest to become leaders by seeking simple solutions. If you statistically study it, very successful CEOs who are pulled out of a company and sent to another company to repeat that success have a lower success rate than people promoted from within. And that's because it's so contextual. What you did before won't work again because no two situations are alike. And so leadership is not only a person's what they've learned and the followers, but it's this confluence of factors that work together. Now, really thoughtful leaders can intuit a situation and respond to it, and they do better. But the reality is it's always this very exercise in adaptability.
I'm not going to ask what you think was perhaps your greatest success in your career, but rather, what do you think, whether you succeeded or not, was your greatest test of leadership, your test?
That's a great question. I'm going to gloss over the first one, but I mean, clearly my greatest test of character is when I failed. And when I failed, when the Rolling Stone article came out and I offered my resignation to the president, that tells you what you're made of after the fact. The greatest test of leadership, and my fear in telling this story is you'll think that it was my success. It wasn't. It was an organizational success. But in the spring of 2005, we were still losing to al-Qaeda in Iraq, and al-Qaeda had essentially encircled the city of Baghdad with the belts, they called them, the suburbs, and al-Qaeda controlled them. And they had gotten into the psyche of the Iraqi people who felt this thing was about to fall. And they were controlling the western Euphrates River Valley, which is the river valley that goes from Al-Qaim in Syria, flows down and goes into Baghdad. They controlled terrain. This was one of the first times al-Qaeda in Iraq controlled terrain, which a terrorist group typically can't do, and they did. And so we were asked by General Casey, the commander in all Iraq at the time, JSOC was a counter-terrorist force, a raid force, was asked to be the main effort and go try to stop al-Qaeda. And we weren't appropriate for that task. We weren't designed for that. We were designed to go after individuals. But you know, I couldn't argue with his need, and so I said, well, we'll do our best. And we had 1/3 of our force in the fight. And the way JSOC works is there's 3 squadrons of Delta, 3 squadrons of SEAL Team 6, 3 Ranger battalions. When you're going full out, you have 1/3 in the fight. And when I talk about in the fight, they fight every night. You have 1/3 on alert back in the United States to go do things around the world. And you have 1/3 training, on leave, getting ready and whatnot. That means they do 4-month rotations. So for 4 months, 120 days, they'll do 110 operations. I mean, combat fights, which is extraordinary. Well, we couldn't do it with the 1/3. And so I got with key leaders in the force. I said, I think we need to put 2/3 into the fight. If you put 2/3 into the fight, that means the other third's on alert. Nobody's resting, nobody's training, nobody's healing wounds and whatnot, and it's not sustainable. You could do it, it's like sprinting, but you could only do it for a limited period. And so in June 2005, we made the decision to put 2/3 of people into the fight. And it was a really emotional decision inside the force. In fact, one of the smartasses on my staff who did the planning named the operation Snake Eyes after rolling the dice. I said, thanks. And we did it, and we knew that if we failed, we risked destroying JSOC. I mean, we could break the nation's counterterrorist force. And as soon as we started it, we had a bunch of casualties. I mean, right away. When you have casualties in that kind of force, it's not like a nameless big force. Everybody's there. Most people are in their little 5-man team for 10 years. Everybody's godparents to everybody else's kids. I mean, it's very tribal. So every time you lose one of these professionals, it takes a decade to replace them. But it's also this incredibly emotional loss. And so we took a bunch of casualties. And we really had that moment where we're not sure this is going to work. And it took about 5 months to determine whether it would work or not. And the organization at that moment, led by certain leaders, one of whom is commanding in Iraq right now, General Scott Miller, just showed this incredible courage, this incredible stoic commitment. They rose up to guide this force, because there was a lot of people worried about it. There was people looking at the leaders to see, can we, should we, are we doing the right thing here? And those leaders stood up, and they were a real lesson to me. They were an example of what leadership's about when it's really hard. And finally, after about 5 months, it became apparent we had succeeded. But it was one of those things where you leave the experience humbled by the people that you serve with.
One of my favorite mantras, a quote that you have in the book, is you say, and it's all about leadership, you say, if when you get on the ground, the order that we gave you was wrong, execute the order that we should have given you. Explain that.
Yeah. You know, people at the headquarters, the senior people always know best. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in charge, right? So you give orders to people, and they're going to go hundreds of miles away, and they're going to go into the dark, and they're going to do a mission. And invariably, the situation's completely different than you thought it was. And you told them to go do X, and they get on the ground, and that's irrelevant or stupid. And the first thing you do is, if you say, I told you to go do X, get out there and do it. And we learned, one, that just didn't work. And two, it wasn't harnessing all the potential in the force. So what we did was we said, if you get on the ground and that order's wrong, you're responsible to execute the order we should have given you, but weren't smart enough to do. And at first it looks like, whoa, I'm taking my responsibility and I'm dumping it on you. And you're doing a little of that. You're saying, I expect you to help own this. But then what we also had to do is says, whatever you do, we'll back you. If you decide to do it differently, we own it. I'm not backing away from responsibility, but I trust you. And so use your head, use your heart, use your gut, whatever it is. And it worked amazingly well, even with very young troops. It was interesting. You say, well, nobody can do that until they're a sergeant first class. Yeah, you could do it with a private first class, because they'll figure it out.
My last question, and we'll turn to the audience. I've had a lifelong fascination with Albert Einstein. I just have so much respect and all the extraordinary things that he did. And it's interesting, in your book, you not only address his intellect, but you paint a leadership model of him that people don't often, they don't know about. Could you just
Sure. I mean, Albert Einstein was a leader. And you go, well, he wrote these amazing papers in 1905, came out with a special theory of relativity. Probably none of us in this room really understand it. But it changed physics, it allowed GPS, it allowed atomic energy, it allowed so many things that we take for granted now. But what he really did was he connected people in the scientific community. He was never elected to anything. The only job, the leadership job he was ever really offered was president of the state of Israel. And he turned it down. And they were actually happy about that because they didn't know what he'd do in his job. But what he became was, he was the most famous man in the world in 1923. A physicist, a German physicist. Most famous man. And he used that celebrity and he used that persona. You know, he looked like everybody's uncle, you know, rumpled suit, you know, big mustache, uncombed hair. He was relatable. You couldn't understand really what he was doing, but you felt a connection to him because he wasn't intimidating. And during his lifetime, he connected other people. He wrote 30,000 letters in his lifetime to other young physicists, of different people. He leveraged the scientific community, which actually was a very well-connected entity at that point, particularly in Europe, that brought other people forward. It brought other ideas forward. It leveraged. And it allowed him to use that which he had, which was this persona, to make other things happen. There's this famous story about, he wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt and said, you should develop the atomic bomb because the Germans are going to do it. It's technically possible and we need to do it. The story's true to the point that he signed the letter. He didn't write the letter. Other people wrote the letter and came to him and said, President Roosevelt will respond to a letter from you. And Einstein was smart enough to go, I can contribute that. And so leadership is always a little different. He probably made a lot of kids study math and science that wouldn't have otherwise studied it. And so that kind of informal leadership is just as important as someone with a title.
Okay, your turn. If you have a question, if you please raise your hand, but don't ask it until we put a microphone in your hand, because we'd all like to hear you. And we'll start right here.
Thank you, General. One of my heroes growing up is Harry Truman, who was a haberdasher by trade, got into the Pendergast system and was elected to Congress, and then forced into the vice presidency and went on to make two of the monumental decisions of the century, dropping the bomb and recognizing Israel, amongst others. How could he come from nothing to be that person to make such monumental decisions?
That's a great question. Of course, the glib and easy answer is he served as an officer in the United States Army. And so, therefore, and I would argue that what he learned through experience were some amazing things. He was in combat in the First World War as an artilleryman. He learned what individual soldiers do. He learned when it's hard, it's dirty, it's wet. He developed an understanding and empathy for that. He then went, in his, not hugely impressive business career, he worked his way up, and then when he got elected to the U.S. Senate, he was elected in an era where they got things done collegially. There were a lot of big disagreements, but one of the things he was famous for is at the end of the workday, senators would come together and they would have this cocktail hour. And from both sides of the aisle would come and they'd have a drink and they'd play cards and do, those kinds of things. But what they did was they knew that they had to have relationships and they had to make things happen. And then as a senator at the beginning of the Second World War, he was two things. He cracked the whip over the government as people were starting to spend huge amounts of money on armaments. There was a lot of room for fraud and waste. And he was cracking the whip there, so he accepted responsibility within a larger context if you have to get the job done. So I think he's a great case of, it wasn't apparent, but he was building up this bank of experiences, this combination of humility, because he didn't think a lot of himself in the sort of grandiose sense, but this absolute understanding and responsibility. The buck stops here is the great line, but the reality is he understood what leadership responsibility was. And when he was informed about the atomic bomb after President Roosevelt's death, because he hadn't been told when he was vice president. Think about the level of responsibility he had to then accept. In the moment, you say, how big a deal is that? It was a huge deal in that moment to make a decision of which there were people really strongly on both sides. So I'm a fellow admirer of him like you, and I love watching kind of how he got there.
Yes, here.
Yes, General, thank you very much for your continued service to our country.
You're kind, sir.
My question is this: after your later observations about El Zakawi, what are your feelings on Defense Minister Bo Win Giap, the former Defense Minister of North Vietnam?
Well, school teacher turned soldier, probably as gifted a strategist as lived in the 20th century. For those of you who aren't as familiar with him, essentially at the beginning of the war against the French, Giap became first a military leader, and then he became this extraordinary strategist. And he gets most credit for the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, when he moved thousands of Viet Minh troops to surround a French post in North Vietnam. He understood war on a level that most soldiers don't. And what I mean is, he understood that war is not the tactics, it's the outcome. And so Giap had this understanding that either against the French or later against the United States, that the Vietnamese would probably not win many battles, would suffer huge casualties, would have to do things that just almost didn't make sense mathematically. But at the end of the day, if they wouldn't quit, if they were willing to accept extraordinary levels of casualties and other things to their force, that first the French and then the United States essentially couldn't compete with that. And so I think it was an incredible level of intuitive brilliance. He also studied a lot. It wasn't like he was just all natural. I mean, he studied the art of it. But this is a case where, and we all run this risk, here's a little Vietnamese gentleman, not impressive to look at, doesn't look like a B-metal, barrel-chested, American or French leader, but who won? And so I got huge regard for him.
Yes, here.
What advice would you give to young leaders in America right now?
Yeah, this is one I'd actually give to anybody. People say watch leaders, and I would tell you to do that. I would, watch what leaders are doing. But I'd start by looking in the mirror. And I'd go home and look in the mirror and I'd say, okay, who am I and what do I want to be? What do I want to see when I look in the mirror, the values, the ethics, and whatnot? What do I want other people to see when they see me? What do I want my children and grandchildren? I know it's a long way from there, but I would tell you, someday that's going to be extraordinarily important to you. And the answer to those questions are going to be more important to you than any position you attain, any money you make, any success you're credited with, because those are going to be the measure of who you are. We have confused, in some cases, celebrity with leadership, success, financial success with leadership, all kinds of things with leadership. And leadership is responsibility at the end of the day. Leadership says, I am responsible because I am helping a group or individuals do something. If you lead them and they do something that's bad, you are responsible. If they are killed or fail in the situation, you are responsible. And I don't mean blame, I'm talking about responsibility. So that's what I would tell you. Think about it on a very basic level. All the things that John mentioned, there are lots of books on techniques and all like that. And there's nothing wrong with reading those because they can all be helpful. But don't ever confuse those with what's at your core, because that's going to be the most important thing. I'm 64 now. And the things I wish I had done more of were study the classics when I was younger. I wish I hadn't missed things. I wish I hadn't worked when there was a family reunion or something like that. It seemed important in the moment. And every time I did something for a relationship, I'm happy I did it, and every time I didn't, it's one of my regrets. Thank you.
Back here, yeah.
Hi, General. I read your book, Team of Teams, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant.
Okay.
I've integrated it into my business. It's been influential. Just so you know, whoever read that, well, I was influenced.
Thank you.
Okay, it was good. The question is, I think that it hasn't yet been told, but you're probably the only one who can really answer this question. What are they doing differently now against ISIS? Because obviously something has changed. I mean, it's changed dramatically. Something is being done differently, and maybe they don't tell us. Maybe we don't know.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good question.
It's a great question, and my answer may be different from what you expect. ISIS was like the fires that happened out here. ISIS hit a moment where Al-Qaeda in Iraq was essentially defeated in 2008, early 2009. We kind of crushed them. The embers were still there, and they grew up to be ISIS. And ISIS was able to suddenly flourish because of the chaos that the civil war in Syria had created, and then poor governance in Iraq. And it had created an environment in which now frustrated Sunnis were fertile ground for very extreme leadership. So ISIS blew up like a brush fire, and with hot winds blowing, it went crazy. And it almost, went almost to Baghdad and whatnot. It couldn't have sustained itself over time because the level of intensity of ISIS burning, a Jordanian pilot in a cage and all that kind of thing. And people, their basic premise of, we'll take you back to the 7th century and we'll have a caliphate. That's not what most even frustrated Sunnis in the region, that's not what they want. What they want was change. What they wanted was some rejection of what was a really frustrating status quo. And so these guys dressed in black who were willing to burn the place down, that was attractive to them because for a period of time, we're so frustrated, bring hell's angels in and raise hell with the place. That's kind of what happened. It was necessarily going to subside simply because that intensity couldn't go. And when people started living under ISIS, poor governance, that wasn't sustainable. So there was a military pushback. Now, the thing that pushed it back, I would love to say it was American military power jumped in and did it. That's only a part of it. In reality, the Iranians largely under Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC's Quds Force, came in, started working with Iraqi forces, started working with Kurds, as were we, and started putting pressure. The Russians came in, and the Russians did. So ISIS sort of got squeezed between all of these different forces, the stabilization of Bashar al-Assad's regime, the increased Russian presence, the rise of the Kurds, the incursion of the Turks, the Iranians coming in, and our actions. The problem is about 5 of those things are long-term problems. They were near-term solutions for the ISIS problem. Long-term, there's something that we're not going to be happy about, and that's the survival of Assad's regime and the presence of the Russians now back in the Middle East, and then the rise of the Iranians through things like the Quds Force. So the region remains challenged. ISIS is a bad thing, but they were never the real problem. They were a symptom of the deterioration of the region, and that deterioration is still there. So we're going to be dealing with that for quite a long time, I think, and we just need a realistic look. I mean, every soldier likes lessened rules of engagement. And so there's truth to that. But I would tell you, from my personal opinion, that is a piece of it. I think the rules of engagement before were too tight. I think loosing them was the right thing to do, but I wouldn't make a causal connection that it was as big an effect as we might want to believe.
Over here.
General McChrystal, thank you very much, sir. As an old Army infantry officer, I follow those campaigns, your efforts, General Petraeus's efforts, Mike Flynn's efforts, particularly JSOC in Afghanistan and Iraq. Everything that I've read about those efforts, it's very inspiring. But I also read that there was basically a disconnect between the American military leaders on the ground in those countries who saw the reality, and then American political leaders, administrators, cabinet secretaries, political advisors, and so forth, who simply did not want to hear the facts, did not want to deal with the reality, particularly when it came to adding additional forces there. How did you deal with that, people that did not want to hear the reality, did not want to hear the facts? And I know that's gone back to previous conflicts, Civil War times and before, but I think it was even more strained in the last 15 years. So thank you, sir.
No, it's a great question. And if you ask me how I dealt with it, I would not claim to have dealt with it well. But you know, you're exactly right. There's always that conflict. There's a built-in tension between civilian leadership and military leadership. It's a little more strained now because, for several reasons. One, we've got a very professional military, which in some ways is a bit insular, a volunteer military. And we've got a civilian leadership that typically has very little military experience. And so, for example, at the beginning of the President Obama's administration, when they came in, there was an intense desire on the part of the administration to get out of Iraq and to not do more in Afghanistan for lots of politically rational reasons. Being a wartime president, particularly in an extended war like that, is not a recipe for success. It's just a real problem, particularly when it competes with other things you want to do. Then you have the military, who's got a nearer view of the problem. So the military's got a problem of this is what we're going to solve. It's not wrong, but nor is it always as strategic as it should be. You know, the military doesn't always see all the factors and we can claim sort of moral righteousness because we're in combat, so you got to, you know, give us what we want. And sometimes we're wrong. The real challenge here is we need to have an interaction, because war shouldn't be fought by the military and ignored by civilians. It's together, because war is a political act. We need to develop a closer relationship between the two. We need to establish, you know, I joke about, they said, what would you do if you were going to fight the war in Afghanistan again? I said, I'd start by taking the president, vice president, secretary of defense, commanding general, and go whitewater rafting. And they go, what? You know, there were times when I would have drowned a couple people in that, but what I really mean is I would have taken several cases of beer, gone whitewater rafting, and gotten to know each other, so that you've been through something, you joke, you laugh, you trust. Then when you're making hard decisions, you're not doing it with one person wearing a uniform and another person wearing a suit at the other end often of a video teleconference, and you're trying to develop this. You're trying to discuss really hard things, and there's not a lot of deep relationships. There's not a lot of trust there, because that's really hard. And that's the part that I walked away from as the most dangerous part of it. We have got to develop that sinews and connections so that we make, you know, holistic decisions. Thank you.
I think we have time for just one last question. I'm sorry, but yes.
General, what did you teach your young soldiers and management team, junior officers, how to improve themselves? So we have young students here graduating from college. You're at the end of your career. You wrote a couple of books. What did you do to learn and develop, and what did you teach those that reported to you how to learn and grow?
Well, I learned really slowly, and I think a lot of my peers did too, on the things that we believe in leadership. I think the first thing is, when you're young, you want to prove your competence. And so you want to learn how to do it yourself so you can show that you're able to do it. And you want to be respected for that. The problem is that's not the recipe to be the best leader, because in reality, the best leader, the organization does it. And then at the end of it, they think they did it all themselves. They don't think they were dependent upon the leader. They may respect the leader, but they think they did it, and to a great degree they did. That means that the leader's got to approach it in a way that what the leader's really doing is building that capacity, building that confidence, building that understanding that they will fail and pick themselves up and move again. But that's not the way a lot of us think, because a lot of us think we have this responsibility to make decisions, to do this, and in reality, we're enablers. It took me half my career to get to the point where that was more apparent to me. And I would urge any young people starting out, speed up that process.
We are out of time, and I wish we had 5 more hours with the General. It's just been terrific to sit and listen to you. It's just so happy to have you here. So thank you on behalf of everyone here, General. Thank you.